So while that's loading, I'm Ann Schuster. I'm the education specialist for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board. My background is in habitat restoration and scientific illustration. So I'm going to very briefly go through weed law in Washington. So noxious weed is a legal term for basically a regulated weed in Washington, and it's been that way since 1975. We add to the noxious weed list every year. So for the next 10 days, less than 10 days, until April 30th is when we take proposals from anyone in Washington for invasive or non-native plants to be added to the noxious weed list or changes to the noxious weed list. So email me with something as simple as I want this plant listed because I don't like it. And then we research it and come to final recommendations for the weed board in September, and then the weed board votes in November, and that whole process starts again later. So every county has their own local weed list that they adopt based on the state weed list. And the weed list is made up of classifications of weeds. So class A are the highest priority species. Usually they're rare or don't exist yet in Washington, and we want to keep it that way. Class B weeds are treated kind of like class A's in certain parts of the state and kind of like class C's in other parts of the state. It depends on really if it's feasible to control it in that area. So like Scotchbroom, for example, it's still feasible to control in most of Eastern Washington, whereas Western Washington, it's not. So Western Washington, it's treated more like a Class C. And in Eastern Washington, it's treated more like a Class A, where it's usually required for control, or yeah, control. Then Class C is the lowest classification of weeds. They're usually very common. Sometimes they're easier to control. Sometimes they're of special interest to certain industries. The monitor list is not on the noxious weed list. It's not regulatory. It's just plants that we want to get more information on. We take reports from citizen scientists on these plants and consider listing them every 10 years or so. The quarantine list is administered by the Washington State Department of Agriculture rather than the weed board. And these are the plants that aren't allowed to be sold in Washington. There's a lot of overlap between the quarantine list and the noxious weed list, but it's not 100%. But that's just another list to keep in mind more for buying and selling. So weed control responsibilities up to the landowner. If you're renting, there might be something in your rental agreement, but for the most part, your county weed board is who's going to enforce on you or your neighbors or somebody you see. And they also might be able to assist you with weed control on like your property or with your neighbor's property. These are some resources that are available in the slide stack for mostly like plant ID, and you've heard from some of these groups like the Invasive Species Council. So, what I primarily want to go through today is how to identify and control these brand new species that have been added to the noxious weed list as of 2025. So I'll do those over these next few minutes. So, common holly was finally added to the noxious weed list. This has been going on for since 2010, so like a decade and a half of going back and forth about listing it and not listing it. It's finally listed. It is listed as a Class C, so it's not required for control anywhere in the state. As we know, it's a shrub. It can be a small tree. It spreads really well by seed. It can also spread vegetatively through branches that touch the ground and branches that are left behind in moist soil. And then it seems like they do also have some root runners to some extent of rhizomes underneath the ground. The primary thing that gets confused with holly is the Oregon grape species. So I'm sure we all know how to identify holly, but if something isn't flowering or making berries, it can be a little bit hard, especially if you're not very familiar with plants. So Oregon grape, they have spiny leaves, but the spines mostly go out, just sort of radiate out in one direction from the midvein of that leaf. It's actually a leaflet, making up many leaflets on the leaf. So that picture in that bottom corner is one leaf made up of many leaflets. Whereas holly, they're not always spiny. They get spinier the more they've been cut or browsed. So those leaves, when they have spines, those spines go all which ways. They're usually a lot harder and spinier than the Oregon grapes. And their whole leaves not leaflets. So the leaf is coming directly from the stem. So if you are in a place that doesn't have holly because you're in like Eastern Washington, I don't know the distribution of the people watching this. So right now holly is known throughout in very high numbers throughout all of Western Washington, but under even the most conservative future climate modeling, it's expected to expand through basically all of Eastern Washington. And it's very adaptable. It likes full sun, full shade, variety of soil types. It can be pretty drought tolerant. So there's so many places in Eastern Washington that it just isn't there yet, but it will be in the future. So keep an eye out, especially in forests where it seems to be particularly damaging. So in forests, it or anywhere, but it seems particularly damaging in forests because it can grow in full shade and it underneath the holly is nothing. It pushes out all understory underneath it. So that bottom picture, that's a site that has just had the holly removed, and there's nothing. There's not even other invasive plants growing underneath it. So hollies gives berries to birds, and that's kind of its only habitat benefit. But that also is what allows it to spread because those birds then poop or regurgitate the berries far away in very remote places. It's also really dangerous in forest fire situations because its leaves are so oily and it's the perfect height to be an intermediary between a ground fire and a crown fire. So it's definitely something to really be worried about in Eastern Washington. So holly is pretty difficult to control once it gets established and once it's a shrub or a tree size. If you can catch it early, that's great. You can pull it out, you can dig it out. Um, Potentially, if it's really, really small, just a couple of leaves, you might be able to just cut it. But if it's that small, you can probably just pull it out. Um, so, like I said, it like fire will kill it, but it will also spread because it's so oily and waxy. Um, if you have an adult tree and you cut it down, it's going to resprout. Any branches that get left behind in moist soil are going to turn into new trees. So it's recommended if you have a full-size tree to use herbicide. So imazapyr is really effective by cut stump. So you cut the tree down and then you apply that herbicide within a half hour of cutting it down, right to that stump. You can also do the same kind of treatment with the herbicide of putting it directly on the tree in like a band around the tree without cutting it down, like a 1 foot band, maybe about a foot up or less from the soil where it comes out of the ground. So that's painting it on. You can't apply herbicide to the leaves because they're so waxy, it'll just drip off. You can also do hack and inject, so you make a cut into the tree and then you squirt in that herbicide. Um, and the most effective way is actually the easy eject lance, which is pretty expensive. So that might be something that people can pool resources to get an easy eject lance system, or maybe borrow one from a noxious weed board that might have some. But that system is very effective, but it is spendy. Marsh thistle is a new class A, so these are required for eradication anywhere they're found. Eradication means killing all parts of the plant so that it can't reproduce on in within Washington at all. That's different from control, which is any part that can reproduce needs to be taken off the landscape. So like Scotch broom, they only reproduce by seed. So you can cut down a Scotch broom plant and that counts as controlled. But if you wanted to eradicate it, you need to take all the root parts and everything out. So marsh thistle is a thistle that gets really tall, as you can tell in that picture. And another thing about it is that it hybridizes with other thistles that we have in Washington that are on the noxious weed list. So it's known to hybridize with creeping thistle and with bull thistle. So creeping thistle is also known as Canada thistle. And marsh thistle on its own only reproduces by seed, but we're pretty sure that when it hybridizes with creeping thistle, it will also reproduce by rhizome because that's the primary way that creeping thistle reproduces. So thistles are kind of hard to identify. They all kind of look alike. Marsh thistle, the rosette is big, but kind of I guess, thin in each one of those leaves. And then in the second year, when it bolts and makes the flowers are more small and will make bunches of many smaller flowers, they'll look more like Canada thistle or creeping thistle than they will like bull thistle or musk thistle or something that has a singular big flowers. So if you see like a really tall creeping thistle that has a rosette, it's not a creeping thistle, it's a marsh thistle. Because creeping thistles don't make rosettes, they just kind of creep along the ground. The flowers, the frills on top of the bracts, they can vary quite a bit, but they tend to be a very bright, deep magenta. And that's brighter than creeping thistles, usually a more paler pink. So marsh thistle is known in, I believe, in the Spokane area is the only place it's ever been found in Washington, and they're working on eradicating it right now. But it is very likely that it is in Whatcom and Island counties due to the known infestations in British Columbia being very close to those areas, and that the seeds can spread on the wind as thistles do. So they like wet areas. They like anywhere that's kind of moist or really soaking. Even in Eastern Washington, like the Spokane area, it's just along the riparian area in a very otherwise dry location. They form monocultures once they really get a hold. So if you have an infestation of marsh thistle that you find, you can hand pull smaller infestations using gloves because they're so spiny. You can mow and cut, and that can suppress flowering, but it won't ultimately kill the plant. The plant's going to keep trying to grow and flower until it'll die after it flowers once. If you can dry a site, that's an option while limiting the disturbance using probably heavy machinery. That's probably not very feasible for a lot of places. You'll disturb wetlands that way. So herbicide is another option, and it's best to apply the herbicide at the rosette stage. I don't know the herbicide specifically for marsh thistle, but due to the relatedness, it's best to use herbicides that are effective on Cirsium species or thistle species, just because the chemical pathways are almost definitely going to be similar or the same. So if you're using herbicide on marsh thistle, you're probably in a wet area. So you want to make sure that you are using the correct herbicide labeled for that site. You want to make sure you have the correct permits to be working in an aquatic or wetland site. And you want to make sure that you yourself or the people working have the correct herbicide licenses to be working in an aquatic site. And the last plant I want to go through is roundleaf bittersweet. So this is another class A. It is a woody vine, and as woody vines do, they spread by seed and also vegetatively from pretty much any plant part that can touch moist soil. So we don't have any woody vines that really look like roundleaf bittersweet. If we were on the East Coast, there is a native bittersweet that can look pretty similar. But here on the West Coast, the only other woody vines we have in our areas are like the honeysuckles and ivy. So bittersweets, the leaves look very different from honeysuckles. They are usually pretty typical leaf shape, rather than like coming out oppositely from the stem. These come out alternately from the stem. And the flowers on bittersweet are not very showy. They're kind of green, white, small, clustered close to the stems and the leaves. They're not big and showy like our honeysuckles. And then the seeds are the most visible in the winter. Similar to holly, the seeds are bright and red and attract birds in the winter. And they mature in late fall and throughout the winter, and they turn out to be big, bright red with showy orange bracts behind them. And things like our ivy and on our native honeysuckles don't look like this at all. Of course, ivy has completely different leaf shape and flowers and seeds when it does flower and seed, rarely. So roundleaf bittersweet is predicted under future climate modeling to expand through most of like the central corridor of Washington on both sides of the Cascades. And pretty much any forested area. Um, I don't have it on here, but there is a map I just saw in the last couple weeks of known current and past sites of roundleaf bittersweet in Washington. There was an eradicated population in Benton County. Um, there's some populations on Vashon Island that are being worked on right now. And also there are some populations on the Oregon side of the border, kind of near Portland, but a bird could easily take a seed from Oregon to Washington. So there are things to watch out for kind of all over the state, even though they're not common currently. Um, and because they climb, they can strangle trees just like ivy can. They spread along the ground, suffocating any ground cover just like ivy does. And then they spread to remote areas with those bird-carried seeds. So if you have an infestation of roundleaf bittersweet, hand pull any small plants that you can find. There will usually be like a littering underneath a flowering female. Then, like ivy, if it's climbing up a tree, you can girdle those climbing vines, but you'll want to control the things left behind below those vines that you girdled because they'll just keep spreading and they'll keep trying to climb. Um, Cutting alone won't kill the plant back. Herbicide is the most effective strategy for bittersweet control once it's an adult. So you can spray the leaves with like triclopyr, ester, or glyphosate. That can be difficult because it might be climbing on desired plants that you don't want to get the herbicide on. So you can also do a cut stem and basal bark treatment. So that's similar to holly, where you can paint the herbicide onto the trunk of the vine, basically. And then you can be a lot more exacting. You can also cut the vine and then apply the herbicide to the top of that cut. And it's best to do herbicide treatments on bittersweet in the autumn because, like many leafy things that are perennial, they're taking their nutrients from their leaves back into the ground for the winter, and that makes them take the herbicide with them. So that's all I want to cover today. So there's my contact information. Thank you.